So I want to introduce Vishnu from Carnegie Mellon. He's doing his PhD there. He previously did a master's at MIT and an undergraduate degree at Michigan. And he's going to tell us about vision-based landing.
All right. Thank you, John, for the introduction. So today I'll be presenting our work on vision-based landing, site evaluation, and trajectory generation for basically towards autonomously landing on top of buildings. So this work is motivated by the idea that we want to be able to deploy micro-air vehicles to execute long-duration sustained surveillance missions. And this comes from the fact that these vehicles are portable, they're fairly simple to work with, and so on. But as a result, these vehicles also are severely limited in their capabilities. And these come from these fairly standard size, weight, and power restrictions that they have. So as a result, what we need to do is we need to be able to autonomously land on top of buildings to conserve energy in order to be able to execute any of these sustained operations. So this leads to the notion of a perch and stare type of task scenario. And the idea of perch and stare is actually gaining a lot of importance in recent years, to the point that in DARPA's recent UAV Forge challenge, they actually incorporated perch and stare as one of the key components that the teams had to demonstrate. And this is just one of their concept of operations videos here. However, I should note that this is an incredibly difficult problem, and no team actually successfully completed this challenge. So the problem we're looking at here is specifically, how do we enable a micro-air vehicle to autonomously land on a rooftop in order to monitor some nearby interest point? So we assume that this interest point is, the location of the interest point is known a priori. And we also assume that we have a constraint on when we need to land. And this would typically come from a higher level mission manager, for example. So then to address this problem, there are two key sets of challenges that we have to tackle. The first is that we have to assume that the rooftop that we're approaching is initially unknown. So we don't know the geometry, we don't have any sort of prescribed landing site on it that we can fly to. So as a result, we need to be able to identify these landing sites online and also assess their suitability for landing as we approach. And in addition, we have to do all this with respect, or within the constraints imposed by these swap constraints on the vehicle. The second challenge is that we then need to be able to plan a trajectory to land at this location, given that we don't actually know where this location is. So there's considerable uncertainty on the location of the landing site. So this means that we need to be able to explore the rooftop to identify potential sites, while at the same time collecting enough information on a given site to ensure that this is in fact a suitable landing site. So there have been many approaches addressing both of these challenges. In terms of the landing site detection, here I've illustrated a few approaches that rely on monocular vision, simply because that's amenable to these swap constrained vehicles. And so many of these approaches rely on trying to reconstruct a 3D model of the scene that they're seeing, and then analyzing this to identify potential landing sites. And this is shown in as an example here in this top figure. However, these approaches are typically concerned with identifying landing sites on the ground, and in essence, trying to avoid clutter or hazardous objects on the ground. Another class of approaches seeks to basically segment what they're seeing to identify a landing site. And this is illustrated by the second pair of images here. However, these approaches typically assume that there's some sort of dominant plane in the world, and that they can use that in order to do this sort of segmentation. In terms of the second challenge, there are many different information-based planning approaches that we could employ for this. And many of these approaches are based on the idea of propagating uncertainty through some sort of sensor model in order to estimate what the information gain will be over this trajectory. However, these approaches typically require a predictive mathematical model of the entire perception pipeline, which is reasonable if you have a simple sensor pointing target, as illustrated in this work. But if you have a more complicated perception pipeline, this just becomes intractable. Other approaches to dealing with this type of uncertainty is another common approach is that people will model this uncertainty as a spatially varying field, as shown here. And then we'll plan trajectories to try and minimize the variance in this field estimate. And what we've seen from these types of approaches is that the measurements that the vehicles collect while they're traversing the world are typically just treated as point observations of the field. And so we're actually losing a lot of the rich perceptual information that we normally get from, for example, a vision system. So in this work, we've proposed an integrated perception and planning system to address these two sets of challenges. So the first component is a self-contained monocular perception system. And what this does is we first start by estimating a 3D model of the environment using a dense motion stereo approach with a variable baseline. And then we can then identify suitable landing sites from this model using, based on an analysis of the disparity map that's generated. And so this is illustrated in this little cartoon down here, with the magenta squares corresponding to high confidence locations. From these measurements, we can generate a landing confidence map in the form of a Gaussian process, which again illustrated by the gradients here. Then the second component is an information-based trajectory optimization, which is driven by this confidence map that we're updating online. So since it's driven by this, we're actually able to automatically balance the need to explore the environment and also collect enough information to assess the suitability of a given landing site. And moreover, since we're constantly getting updated perception data, we are constantly replanning online so that we can use this updated data to identify better landing sites and ultimately land at the best possible site to execute the perch and stare task. So just a brief outline of the rest of the talk. I'll go into some more detail on the perception system, the GP-based confidence map, and then this information-based trajectory optimization. And then I'll present a set of results where we were able to validate the functionality of this planner through a set of simulations, and then validate the perception system through actual indoor flight test results. And then finally, I'll present a set of outdoor flight tests where we are starting to bring these two components together to actually demonstrate the full functionality. So starting with the perception system. So we consider the case where we have a micro-air vehicle that's equipped with a downward-facing gimbaled monocular camera. And we assume that the motion of the camera can be estimated on board the vehicle through a combination of IMU data and visual odometry data. And then as the vehicle flies, we're able to maintain a frame list of image frames along with corresponding tracked features. From this list of frames, we can then select pairs of images to actually do the stereo matching. And we can select these frames such that they satisfy requirements on the number of matched features between the pair, as well as the baseline in terms of the separation between the images. And so this baseline can be determined based on, or the requirements for a baseline come from requirements that we can impose on the depth accuracy at ground level. So this is just a mission level component or constraint we can enforce. However, to actually do dense motion stereo, we need a much more accurate estimate of the motion between these two pairs of images. So to do this, we actually estimate the rotation and translation between the pair of images using a multiplanar homography approach. So once we have this estimate, we can calculate the disparity map using standard stereo matching techniques. And from that, we can generate a 3D point cloud of the scene being observed by the vehicle as it flies. And so this is illustrated by this image down at the bottom here. So finally, once we have this information, we can start to identify potential landing sites in the environment. So to do this, we start by segmenting out anything that we determine to be at ground level. So we want to land on top of the building, so we start by removing the ground. So those are indicated by the green patches in this figure here. So once we do that, we can then compute the variance along the gravity vector at each point of the disparity map. And we do so using a local kernel. And so this local kernel allows us to capture information on the vehicle size, altitude, focal length, the required depth accuracy, and the disparity value for this for the system. So as a result, since we're incorporating all this into the local kernel, we can simply look at areas that have low variance in the disparity map and determine that these correspond to planar level areas in the environment that are sufficiently open for the vehicle to land there. And so then these suitable regions are illustrated in blue in this top figure. So furthermore, we can also assign landing confidence values to each of these points based on the variance that we get from this disparity map analysis. And so the landing confidence value is illustrated by the color gradient in this lower figure here. Then, in order to generate a consistent map across the entire rooftop, we use a Gaussian process to spatially smooth these observations across frames. So in this work, the Gaussian process basically serves as a mapping from positions to confidence values. And essentially, you can interpret the GP as providing a mean confidence value at a location as a weighted sum of all the training data we've accumulated. So then if we have a confidence image such as this coming from the perception system, we start by downsampling the image to something that looks roughly like this. And so this provides us some nice filtering capabilities so that we're not reacting to any noise in the perception system. And it also helps with the tractability of actually feeding this into a Gaussian process. The downsample points are then added to the set of training data, and this allows us to then compute a conference map over everything we've seen using the Gaussian process. So then finally, we take the mean of the GP and threshold that, and then discretize it in order to identify a set of distinct high confidence landing sites across the rooftop. And from this set, we can then identify the landing site that's closest to our interest point. So this again gets back to the idea of the perch and stare task. So we identify the landing site that's closest to that and say, this is currently our best landing site. So since we're using the GP, we can also use this in a predictive sense to determine the potential value of a set of future measurements that we might take. And this comes from the fact that the weights in the GP are only determined by the inputs. So there's no reliance on the actual output of the GP when computing these weights. And so as a result, we can actually very accurately estimate what the contribution will be for an arbitrary set of measurement locations to the confidence value at a particular test point. And to do this, we simply take the existing training data and augment this with the locations of this potential set of future measurements. And then we can just recalculate the weights using the standard Gaussian kernel, as shown by this literally textbook equation. So the nice thing from this is that we can then compute the relative contribution of this new set of measurements by simply taking the sum over all their corresponding weights. So having this capability allows us to then formulate the objectives for the trajectory optimization. So our goal here is to plan an optimal polynomial trajectory to guide the vehicle to land at a particular landing site. And so we consider 3 objectives. The first is that we want to minimize jerk in order to minimize the effects of motion blur. And this just comes straight from the vehicle dynamics and how the camera is mounted on the system. The second objective is that we wish to maximize our confidence on the currently selected landing site. So we obviously do not want to land at a site where we've only seen 1 or 2 measurements of that location. And so this is an information-based objective and can be thought of as, in some sense, an exploitation objective. And this is formulated as essentially the total relative contribution of a set of measurements taken at k steps along the trajectory. And so that's just exactly what's shown here. The final objective is an exploration objective, where we want to actually cover as much of this rooftop as possible in order to make sure that we find the best possible landing site. And so this actually takes a very similar form to the previous objective in that it's also an information-based objective. But there are 2 key differences that I want to highlight. The first is that the expected contribution of these measurements are computed with respect to the interest point as opposed to the landing site as was done in the previous metric. And the second change is that the standard deviation that we consider is much larger than what we considered for the previous objective. And this actually leads to this rewarding exploration of the environment. So once we have these objectives, we can formulate the actual trajectory optimization. And we do so as a multi-objective minimization over the spline coefficients. So the weights on the objective functions are selected in order to balance the relative magnitudes of these terms. And the selection is also informed by the standard deviations that I mentioned on the previous slide. As I mentioned at the beginning, we assume that our end time is fixed a priori. And this, again, is to help guide the vehicle to land quickly so we can conserve as much energy as possible. So then the constraints on the optimization simply serve to ensure continuity with the vehicle's current state, and then ensure that the vehicle actually lands within the bounds of the landing site at the allotted time. So then to validate this planning approach, we ran a set of simulation trials that use a simulated rooftop environment shown here. And so the trajectory that you see up here is the initial trajectory coming out of the planner. And you can see it actually keeps the vehicle aloft for a fair amount of time before descending. So this encourages, allows it to explore. So as it goes through, it continues to generate these types of trajectories to continue exploring. But as it accumulates more data, it starts to transition to this exploitation objective. However, this is a gradual transition, so it continues to explore to some extent, and ultimately finds the best possible landing site that it can see and does a focused descent to that point. And so one of the key features I want to highlight for this approach is that the transition from this exploration to exploitation objective happens automatically. So there's no prescribed trigger that switches from one to the other. And so we can see this by looking at the relative contribution of these two objectives to the total reward that the vehicle sees, and which is shown in the graph down here. So initially we see that there's a very high reward for exploration, which is exactly as you'd expect. However, over time, the relative value of these observations that it's collecting start to decrease. And as a result, the exploitation metric becomes relatively more important. And so this decrease is actually a direct consequence of the fact that we're using the Gaussian process. And with the GP, we typically see diminishing returns as we continue to add training data to the, add measurements to the training data. So then to evaluate the perception system, we move to a set of experimental tests. So the platform we use is an Aztec Humenberger quadrotor, shown here. And the vehicle is equipped with an Odroid U2 quad-core computer, which is extremely lightweight, as well as a grayscale matrix vision MV Blue Fox camera, which is also very lightweight. And the vehicle also has onboard pose estimation running at 30 hertz, using a combination of visual odometry and IMU. So to test the perception system, we ran a sequence of flights indoors over, actually over the stack of boxes, representing a virtual rooftop scenario. And the perception system was run at 1 hertz. And so the boxes allow us to evaluate some ground truth. So then to measure performance, we looked at the 3D reconstruction accuracy, specifically in terms of how accurately can we estimate the height of this landing site. And so the figure up top shows our estimates from one of these trials, and compared to the actual ground truth height of the top of the boxes. And so we were able to remain within, for the most part, 3 centimeters of this height. And 3 centimeters is actually what we set within the local kernel for the perception system as the desired depth accuracy. Our average reprojection error from this was also quite small, around 0.2 pixels across all these trials. So during these flights, we also evaluated our ability to detect the landing site accurately. So since we, as illustrated by the dashed lines in this figure, we knew exactly what the true feasible landing site was, we were able to assess the fact that in 90% of the frames that we collected, we were able to correctly identify that landing site. And moreover, we were able to do so with an extremely low false positive rate. So then to actually test this in a more realistic scenario, we conducted a set of manual flights over a 1-story building, which is shown here. And so we used the data collected from this to verify that we can, in fact, accurately reconstruct the scene below the vehicle. So you can see the building here has the same general shape as the vehicle, as the building here, and the dimensions are all consistent. So during the flight, we also online calculated all these confidence values that I mentioned before. And this allows us to basically, just as in the simulation, build a confidence map GP by stringing together all of this data. And so again, you can see in the figure up here, the blue regions correspond to high confidence values or potential landing sites, which are illustrated by the magenta sections here. So then, just as in the simulations, we can again threshold this and identify the best landing site given the location of our interest point. And then finally, we compute the remainder of the trajectory as if we were to land from that point at that computed location. So these outdoor flight test results demonstrate that our perception system is actually able to work just as consistently as we've seen indoors. So we again had a 90% success rate on detecting valid landing sites when the rooftop was in view, and also had a comparable reprojection error. Looking at the confidence map and the landing sites we detect, we also can see that this is consistent with the actual geometry of the rooftop. So you can see here there's a fairly large empty section, blue section, which corresponds to the cluttered part of the rooftop out here. And so this illustrates that any effects that pose uncertainty may have had, for example, has been adequately compensated for by the GP. So just to recap, what I've presented here is a system that enables a micro-air vehicle to autonomously land on top of a building in order to execute a perch and stare type of task. And so the components, we use a dense motion stereo-based perception system to identify these sites, and then a GP-based confidence map to smooth these observations and drive an information-based planning approach. And these planned trajectories automatically trade off between exploration and exploitation. And then we validate each of these components through a combination of simulation, indoor and outdoor flight tests. And right now, we're currently in the process of integrating all these components onboard the actual system to actually test the entire integrated system outdoors. And I guess with that, I'll open up to questions. Thanks.
Questions?
I wonder why you concentrate on stereo and disregarded motion, which seems to me a better source of information when you have to land on a surface, more than hovering over, deciding where to go, and then basically landing blind.
So we're not landing blind because we have a downward-facing camera. So that is actually the motivation for having the downward-facing camera, so that we can actually continue to observe the landing site as we approach it. And so I didn't catch the first part of the question.
Something like measuring time to contact and this kind of information, which can be on motion parallax. You can keep information while you move instead of having to hover over the roof and then land.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. So I guess we haven't really considered that, but at least the way that it's set up right now, we can actually basically augment the system with that type of information. So. Sure. So I guess the original motivation for using the GP was that just, I guess, the simplicity of integrating all this information, and then providing us, I guess, flexibility in terms of the discretization. Whereas if you were to start with a predefined discretization, you're basically confined to that. And so this gives us some more flexibility in terms of different environments we might be operating in, and so on. Sorry, what is that again? Yeah, so sure. So I guess the question is, how would we take into account structural aspects of the landing site and structural integrity? So yeah, that is a very difficult question. I know there's been a fair amount of work in trying to assess exactly those types of questions even for larger vehicles and so on. So that is quite difficult to do with limited sensing. For example, for this type of platform, we would only have a single camera on board. So yeah, I don't know offhand exactly how you would do that. But if you had additional sensing, or perhaps you could use texture information, for example, to try to classify what type of material you're looking at, and maybe try to back out some information from that.
One last question? I'll ask a question.
Right.
What if you had strong winds or environmental disturbances? Imagine it was in a storm or something.
Right. So that's actually one of the other aspects that we're looking into, and it's actually some of the work I presented at ICRA starts looking into that. And basically, yeah, that is a very realistic concern that we have to be able to deal with. And we can start to actually use some of these same type of ideas to do, kind of try to estimate the effects of the wind online and try to compensate for that either through feedback control or some sort of adaptive planning approach.
Great. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.